So I started writing memos to the Democrats about how to use moral psychology to win more elections. And I would send these memos around to people, and as far as I know, nobody read them. I had no connections. But I resolved to really study conservatives in order to help the Democrats win.
Hello, I'm Giles Fraser, and welcome to Confessions, a new podcast all about faith, ideas, philosophy, ethics. Every week I'll be joined by a guest to ask them what it is that makes them tick. I'll be digging down into their core beliefs and values to try and understand better who they are and what they're all about. And here today, bearing their soul to me in the stall in this first episode, is the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, was one of those books that sort of hit me with the force of a sledgehammer, and so many of the people I know have read it with sort of great profit, Jonathan. And so it's a delight to have you here and just to shoot the breeze with you for half an hour or so. The way in which we tend to, we've sort of like decided to sort of set up this podcast is we start talking about where you're from and your background and something like that. So perhaps you tell me something about your upbringing, your childhood.
No, certainly, yeah, because in this case, it is relevant. So thanks for having me on. What I've read about you gives me, I have no idea what to expect except that it's likely to be fun. So let's just get started and see what happens.
Yeah.
So I was born and raised as it's sort of an absolutely stereotypical modern upper middle class American Jew. My grandparents came from Russia and Poland, escaping pogroms. My father was very poor and growing up in New York City. My father was a successful attorney, moved up to Scarsdale, New York, a town that had been, as they said, they didn't let the Jews in for so long, let the Jews up and bought the place, something like that. So it's very much the American story.
Yeah.
And went to Yale for college, was on the left. I ran a handgun control group. So I was always on the left, a very, typical...
and were your parents on the left? Is that...
Yes. My father would sort of waver back and forth, but my mother was very clearly on the left. And, my grandparents were socialist labor organizers. American Jews are very progressive on social issues in particular. And so that's what I always was. And the other relevant factor is that I became an atheist within a year or two of my bar mitzvah. I remember having arguments with my best friend whose father was a reverend, and I was taking the atheist side. And so I'm exactly the sort of kid who would have become a new atheist, when all the Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins books came out. I was very hostile to religion throughout my teens and 20s. So that's one line. But the other line that then intersects with it is that I happened to pick moral psychology as my topic in graduate school. I majored in philosophy undergrad and then went to the University of Pennsylvania for my PhD. And while there, I took a class from a wonderful anthropologist, Alan Fisk, who had us all read ethnographies, book-length stories of other cultures, and that just completely blew my mind, that morality could be so different, yet at the same time, it's all clearly built out of the same building blocks. Like you see, the regulation of menstruation and sex taboos, and they're often so similar in the Old Testament, in the Book of Manu, in the Quran. So I thought, wow, there's something really deep psychological here. And that's been my quest ever since then, ever since the late 80s, is what are the building blocks of human morality? And how are they put together into an actual cultural morality? So all that time, I'm still on the left. And then I get a fellowship. I do a postdoc at the University of Chicago with Richard Schwader, an anthropologist who really changed my life. And while working with him, I got a fellowship to study in India, and that's what really did it for me. Because if I had, I could easily have been very offended at how sex segregated and religious and the inequality. I mean, a lot of Americans travel to India and are offended by certain things, but that didn't happen to me because I was really trying to understand their world from the inside, and Schwader helped me. Moral psychology helped me. That's where I began to understand what a world so saturated with meaning, where people have roles to play, what does it look like? What are they trying to do? And so once I understood that, I literally came home in 1993. I only spent 3 months there. I came home, and all of a sudden, I could, for the first time ever, understand the religious right in my own country. So that was the breakthrough for me. Right.
And is the key thing that you discovered, as it were, I'm asking you, this is not telling you, is that there's something beyond the sort of harm morality, that morality is more than just a question, a sort of utilitarian question of harm and so forth. There are other sort of components to it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was exactly like, for any listeners who read the book Flatland, really one of the best books. Okay.
No, I don't know.
You would love this book.
Okay.
It's a novel about about geometric characters, written by an English mathematician who clearly has some Christian background too. It's about a two-dimensional creature who's visited by a three-dimensional creature, and if you live on a plane and a sphere visits you, all you see is a circle, and the three-dimensional character tries to explain what it is to come from above, and this two-dimensional can't get it. You mean north, south, east, or west? There's no such thing as above. And he doesn't understand until the three-dimensional creature takes the two-dimensional creature down to the world of the one-dimensional creatures. And anyway, it's this wonderful metaphor worked out about how there's certain dimensions you can't understand. And so going to India while reading a lot of anthropology and being as open and tolerant as I could, that for me was like being dragged into the third dimension.
Yeah.
I realized that my progressive morality, based on the idea of really just harm and fairness, that's it, that's what morality is, that there are normative questions like, okay, is that the best morality? But you can't even address those unless you know what the other moralities are. And I didn't know it until I was in my 30s.
Yeah. And so you use the metaphor of taste, don't you? As taste, as there's sort of 5 different taste sensors, and that roughly those on the left get about 3 of them, and that those on the right generally use another couple.
Oh, that's right. So what I've always been trying to do, I was in graduate school, I was really knocked over by two powerful ideas. One is anthropology, or a vision of cultures being variable. The other is evolutionary psychology, the recognition that we are evolved creatures. Our brains evolved just as surely as our hands did. And so how do you fit those together? And the metaphor, I love metaphors. I'm probably going to dump way too many of them on you here. But the metaphor that I came up with is that, a lot of people say, well, morality is like language. It's got a grammar. No. I don't think that's a good metaphor. The best metaphor is taste. So if you're a human being, you have 5 different kinds of taste receptor on your tongue, and they're there because of our evolutionary history. They're sweet, sour, salt, bitter, and umami, or meat. Basically, what you'd expect if your ancestors were fructivores who also ate meat. You have what you need to find the right food sources. And human beings like sweet all over the world, but our cuisines are different. So how does that happen? Well, you need to look at the local resources, the cultural history. So it's the same thing for morality. So we're all mammals. We all have all kinds of software that go along with our hardware for bearing our young live and then nurturing them for more than a decade. So care and compassion, we all have it. And what I found empirically is if you look at the protest signs at left-wing rallies, and so in my talks I show photos from Occupy Wall Street, there's a lot. It's not just about fairness. It's actually a lot about compassion, love. So people on the right love their children and dogs too, but they don't talk about their political morality that way. So care, the next one is fairness, which can either be proportionality or equality, depending on which side of the spectrum you're on. Liberty is the third. Loyalty, group loyalty is the fourth. Authority versus subversion is the fifth. And the sixth is sanctity versus degradation. Now, there are more than these 6, but if you know these 6, it's like a set of magic glasses with all these refracting prisms. You look at all the weird stuff that comes up in the news, like, why are people upset about this? Or I can't believe they said, and you look at this, you always see these 6 taste receptors being activated or denied.
Yeah. And those who are more progressive tend not to get things like
loyalty, authority, and sanctity. That's right.
Yes.
There are left-wing versions, especially of sanctity, but there's that wonderful what is it? There's a Monty Python skit from Life of Brian where we're the People's Liberation Front of Judea. No, we don't talk to the Liberation Front of the Judean people.
Yeah.
So the left tends to not do group loyalty as well. It tends to be more like herding cats.
Yeah.
The right tends to be better at coming together to fight a common enemy.
Yeah. Not in this country at the moment, by the way.
Well, okay, may you live in interesting politics.
Yeah. But I'm interested in disgust and that side of things because you famously asked the question, or the question is associated with you about having sex with a chicken that you buy in the supermarket.
Yes, that's right.
And this is a sort of great moral question because there's no obvious way in which you can cash out why that's wrong in terms of harm or terms of justice and fairness. The chicken's dead.
Yeah.
So there's no... But actually, there is a sort of visceral and visceral is a word I'd associate with you, but there's a visceral sort of sense that there is something wrong about this.
Yes, that's right. So if you think about human beings as creatures that evolved to live in a certain way, and when the early explorers from Europe went around the world, they found that wherever they went, people tended to have rites where they danced around a campfire to rhythmic music while painting their bodies and making certain things sacred. So we evolved, I think, for small-scale religion, and we have a sense of sacralization. We worship things together that binds us together. As we develop a money-based economy, as we trade, morality thins out, and it sort of narrows down to just, I won't hurt you, you don't hurt me, we can make a deal, we honor our contracts. That's basically it. And so you find that more in Amsterdam or London or great trading capitals hundreds of years ago is where that morality first comes to be. But the mental circuits to do all the primitive stuff, the sanctity stuff, the ritual stuff, they're still in there. They're still in there, and boy, can you see it if you look at sporting contests, if you look at college football games in the United States, you still see that stuff. So that's kind of an indirect way of explaining why I asked hundreds and hundreds of people what they thought about a man who has sex with a chicken carcass and then cooks it and eats it. And the reason is because I wanted to really – what I found was whenever I would interview people about things that seemed to violate taboos, they would always find a harm-based reason. They'd say, oh, no, well, it's wrong to do that because someone will take offense, they'll be upset. And so I wanted something that violated a food taboo and a sex taboo and had no witness and no possible harm. And what I found is that in doing that chicken story, well-educated college students would generally say, well, it's disgusting, but, it doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, if he's not hurting anyone, and it is recycling, so I guess that's okay. Yeah, no, one literally said that. But that was 1 out of 12 groups in my study. It was done in Brazil and the U.S., two Brazilian cities and Philadelphia, across social classes, across age. Everybody else, or almost everybody else, acted as though if it's disgusting, that is a reason to say that it's wrong. And so I think we have to recognize that modern, secular, progressive moralities are at least unique in separating disgust from moral judgment. Now, not entirely. Nobody can do it entirely. But most of the world thinks that things that are degrading, things that pollute the spirit, that are incompatible with our spiritual nature, most people on earth think that that is morally wrong.
Yeah. Though there's a debate about, the sort of phrase, the wisdom of disgust,
the wisdom
or
of repugnance,
wisdom of repugnance, which is associated with the right, really.
Yes, correct.
And you feel, you read someone like Martha Nussbaum sort of wrestling with a phrase like this and trying to make some sense of it, and both feeling the pull of it, but also not really wanting to. Not wanting to endorse it either, because of course repugnance is also the repugnance of mixed marriages and things like this as well. So.
That's right. So that's the conundrum. So the phrase was coined by Leon Kass, who is considered to be a conservative ethicist in the United States. And he originally, he had been opposed to in vitro fertilization and various other practices that sort of, changed conception and our conceptions of family and life away from more traditional notions. And so on each particular one, where we've had innovations that really benefit people, like in vitro fertilization, I think one can say, well, that wisdom was wrong. And even if it creeped us out at first, it's a very good thing that we got over it. And obviously for gay marriage, for all sorts of reasons. So I would never say there's a wisdom of repugnance that cannot be questioned. I would never say that. But the other extreme is to say, let's totally ignore that. Let's just reduce morality to if it feels good and doesn't hurt anyone, do it. And I think that we end up, if you follow that, we end up in a very thin world where people's spiritual needs are not satisfied. And I think, quite frankly, they're much more open to cults, charismatic leaders, and demagogues.
The liberal in you, it sounds like if there's a clash between the harm-based principle and the repugnant, as it were, based principle, that the harm one trumps it. Is that right?
Well, in general, in any specific instance. Okay, you know what? I'm going to bring out my favorite concept from the righteous mind, which nobody, like literally 0 people, have mentioned or quoted.
Oh, come on.
Okay, I can try it with you because you have an anthropology background. So I called it Durkheimian utilitarianism.
Right.
What I mean by that is I think that social policy, if you're the government in the UK or the US and you represent the people, of course your policies have to aim for the maximum good. As a first principle, I think public policy should be broadly utilitarian.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that individuals individuals have to live their lives as utilitarians, but public policy, I think, should be broadly utilitarian. The problem is when you get utilitarians making policy, they tend not to have a full understanding of human nature. They tend to have a very thin conception. They measure more of a Benthamite conception about utiles, or this will lead to this many ounces of pleasure, and So the view I came up with in The Righteous Mind is, okay, you can be a utilitarian policymaker as long as you've read Emile Durkheim, as long as you understand, as Durkheim did when he was trying to help France secularize its schools. You can't just pull the religion out of the schools and put nothing else back. You have to have something that supports a sense of authority and a sense of belonging. And that's what I think social engineers often don't recognize as they're re-engineering institutions.
If you read Peter Singer, and someone that, from on that extreme as a utilitarian, and I had a conversation with him not that long ago about where you should give your money and so forth. And if you go for Peter Singer, you never prioritize your family, you never prioritize those close to you. In the end, I think he'd probably want to give all his money to liberating chickens from chicken farms. I mean, I think that's probably on a utilitarian calculus, that's where he'd end up. Yeah. And there's a part of me that goes, that I'm sorry, my family is a part of, there's something closer to me than this utilitarian calculation.
That's a great example.
That can really understand.
That's a perfect example. I'm very fond of Peter Singer personally. Yep. I spent a year at Princeton. I'm very fond of the man. But that's the perfect example that if you, I can understand his arguments, his logical arguments for increasing utility, but what kind of world would you rather live in? One in which we all give to chickens or people far away until everything is even, or a world in which we have family attachments and we honor those attachments, and we also try to help those far away. But I think it is not really a human world, one in which we all calculate the maximum benefit we could do. And so again, public policy, I think, should be utilitarian broadly. But I don't want to live in a world where everybody is utilitarian.
I nearly said to him, you must give rubbish Christmas presents. No justification for giving your kids nice Christmas presents.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you give them a voucher to give to a charity.
So, one of the things about The Righteous Mind is that it reads like advice from a sort of friendly leftist to other leftists.
Yes, that's how it. Yep.
To slightly get their act together when it comes to campaigning for broadly progressive agenda.
Yeah, that's how the book began. The origins of the book. So here I was studying how morality varies across cultures. I was working in Brazil and India, and I found that social class was even bigger. And then George W. Bush defeated Al Gore in 2000. Gore should have won in a landslide, and I couldn't stand it. Gore had no idea how to talk about morality. So, okay, I go on with my life. I just met the woman who became my wife. We're getting married. We're doing our thing. And then in 2004, John Kerry loses to George W. Bush. And once again, the Democrat has no idea how to talk about morality, and the Republicans do. So I started writing memos to the Democrats about how to use moral psychology to win more elections. And I would send these memos around to people, and as far as I know, nobody read them. I had no connections. But I resolved to really study conservatives in order to help the Democrats win. That's a problem we have in the American Academy. You may have it here, that because everyone is on the left pretty much, in the social sciences and humanities at least, almost everyone's on the left. And so I was going to use my work to help one side. And in the process, I discovered that there is more than one side. I mean, I've never become a conservative, but I now see that things are a lot more complicated. And any system that's charged with finding truth must have viewpoint diversity. You can't understand things until you listen to your critics and your opponents. You smell like you have moved a little bit.
Yeah,
I've moved in that I'm not a partisan. Yeah. I mean, I've never voted for a Republican. I'm horrified by my I can't even say the words.
Can you say the words? My president.
Yeah, by the president of the United States. I'm horrified by him. So in that sense, but no, I don't.
It's not a man who knows how to talk about morality, though. I mean, you wouldn't say that. I mean, in terms of there's a part of the right that uses the language of morality that the left doesn't. This is not a case with Trump, is it?
Well, so Trump is a very interesting case in that he has a kind of a morality which I don't call it a moral foundation, but maybe it is. You do find the idea often that might makes right, or a morality of strength. So I didn't consider that to be a moral foundation. Trump does have a worldview. He does see people as good and evil, as enemies and allies. I think it's quite striking that he has no friends, as far as I know. I don't think he has any friends that he's brought with him through different stages of his life. So I think he has a lot of problems with his personal morality. But he is not a man, he is not a psychopath. That is, he is not a person who has no sense of that there is a moral order. He does have one. He does horrible things with it, but he's very moralistic in his way.
I never quite understood whether he has that sort of part of him sounds a bit like a communitarian when he talks about the sort of the nation and the us and so forth, and yet he is also this sort of New York businessman who's with this sort of very individualistic me type of thing. And the tension between the I and the we.
Except that I wouldn't. He's not like a New York businessman like Wall Street. He's more like the kind of guy who hung out with construction crews, mafia-influenced gangs, and is a tough guy. And so, in some ways, that could actually be good on the world stage.
No,
I mean, a guy who knows how to, would be. Whereas, I love Barack Obama, but he didn't have that kind of toughness. He wasn't necessarily cut out for a world of thugs. So if Trump was Machiavellian, if he could make a plan and stick with it and use devious means to attain his ends over a long-term period, he could actually be quite effective, as Richard Nixon was. But Trump, the general view among psychologists I talk to is that the problem is that it's just narcissism. It's just everything revolves around him, and that makes for a bad leader and bad policy.
Is there a sort of boiled down version of what the left could take away from your research, such that they could, implement it, or is it just unimplementable within a sort of broadly progressive?
Oh no! It's my goodness. I mean, the whole book. The book began in that way. So a couple pieces of advice. One, recognize that we are all so limited, so prone to confirmation bias that until you're exposed to the other side, you simply won't even know what they think. And so if you're tired of being surprised that the right does better than you thought, if you're tired of being surprised that voters aren't listening to your message, try listening to the other side. A huge problem that the left has in the United States is that as it moved off the shop floor, off of the sort of the workers and the factory line and the farms, as it moved into the universities in Hollywood and New York, San Francisco, it lost touch. It encased itself in a bubble. And so this is Mark Lilla's argument in The Once and Future Liberal. So the first thing is have some epistemological humility. Do what's right for yourself to make yourself smarter. Get out of the bubble, expose yourself, read more, listen to your critics. That's the first thing. If you do that, you'll make fewer mistakes. You'll commit less sacrilege. That's what got me to get involved in politics. Was I kept seeing Democrats saying things, like not wearing a flag pin and just things like simple things. If you're going to campaign for president, you need to show that you are the high priest of the civil religion. I know it's a phrase that I've seen you use. So, I think you have to at least, I'm not saying the Democrats need to change what they think is right and wrong, but I do think that they suffer from being too closed off in a closed epistemic world. And the big problem we have now in America and many other places is the masses are just fed up with the elites. And anybody who seems to be lecturing down to them without understanding them, we're coming apart in America not by state, but by the top metropolises versus the rural areas. And the Democrats feed into that.
I mean, this country, we're following that as well. I mean,
that's right.
One thing about Brexit is that it illustrates, on the left, it illustrates the sort of gap that's opened up between northern working class, for instance, and university towns, university-educated, London type of people. And that gap is a massive problem for the left.
That's right. It's happening in France very much the same way. So I think what we need to understand here, maybe this will be the transition to the next book. What we need to understand is that we're in a kind of a game of, it's not three-dimensional chess. It's rather that society is evolving on multiple dimensions. And there's an economic dimension in which globalization has put us all into the same market, and there are some common winners and losers. And the working class, which was a big winner of the early post-war years, the 1940s and 50s and 60s, is not. So we have an increasing separation due to globalization. We also have social media is changing everything in all of our countries, sowing distrust, amplifying polarization. So we're coming apart in ways that are very alarming. We need to rethink a lot of things if we're going to get more effective politics, and if we're going to be able to show that the Anglo-American model of democracy and free market can work.
So this does take us quite neatly into your new book, because one of the important complaints that the coddling of the American mind highlights is the way in which our sort of universities have become cut off from and cut themselves off from not just working class experience, but all sorts of experience that they find offensive. And then there's this idea of how offence works to sort of well, I guess, it's obviously a reference to the closing of the American mind, but
Yeah. So what happened, the origin of the book, is that a new moral culture emerged in the 2013 to 2014 academic year. Ideas that none of us had really seen, that were quite surprising and hard to make sense of. It was a combination of students asking for safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggression training, acting as though books, words, ideas, and speakers were not just wrong or offensive, but dangerous. Dangerous. If this person is allowed to speak, people will be traumatized. You have to protect us. And a lot of us scratched our head like, what on earth is going on? And so my friend Greg Lukianoff, who runs the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, he came to me to talk to me about this because he had suffered a suicidal depression in 2007. And when he learned CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, he learned how to question his thinking, how to catch himself making distortions like catastrophizing. And so then in 2013, 2014, he sees students asking for protections from speech, and they're catastrophizing, mind reading, discounting the positives, black and white thinking, all the things he learned to not do. And so he thought, well, if students are thinking this way, it's going to make them depressed and anxious. So he came to talk to me. I thought it was a great idea. I'd just begun to see the first traces of this in January, February of 2014. It was really very fast moving. And so we wrote up this article in The Atlantic. It came out in the summer of 2015. And only after that did all hell break loose at American universities. At Halloween, there were protests at Yale over the controversy of, not over whether anyone actually wore an offensive costume. I don't think anybody did. But there was a memo about whether students...
Mexican hats or... that's the sort of thing.
Exactly, that sort of thing. So it was a sort of a meta issue. It was not even over the costumes. It was whether it was appropriate for the university to tell students what they can wear. The point is it escalated. There were widespread protests over many issues, and a new culture emerged, one in which there was no longer any sense of giving people the benefit of the doubt. It was rather what you might call a call-out culture. That is, whatever you say can and will be taken in the worst possible way. You will be accused of the worst possible thing, so watch what you say. Students now are walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
Professors are too.
Yeah.
And so the academic climate, it can't work if we're afraid. It can't work if we're afraid to raise objections, if we're afraid to speak openly and honestly. I'm not talking about yelling racial slurs. Obviously, there's no room for that in a community of trust. So people, it's sort of a red herring, like, oh, free speech, or should there be limits on free speech? I don't even want to talk about that. I just want to talk about what's the special community it takes to find truth together, and that has receded far into the distance since 2015 at our top schools.
Is it? I've read somewhere you say something like this: is that the campus becomes another sort of, sort of temple space, as it were, in which the presence of the pollution of ideas other than a sort of liberal progressive ideas isn't this another sense of doesn't this refer a bit back to the disgust stuff?
Yes. Oh my God, what a nice connection back. That's exactly it. Yeah. So here's a puzzle. All this stuff broke out on American campuses, and I thought it was just an American thing. But within 1 year, it was clear, no, this is a British thing too.
Yeah.
And then it became clear it's also Canadian, and it's a little bit in Australia, and but it's not in France or Germany or Scandinavia. So, there's political correctness everywhere. But this idea that students are fragile, that they will be harmed, traumatized, this is a uniquely Anglosphere thing. And I think, we don't know why, and again, it's changing so fast, it might emerge in France and Germany this year, who knows. But I think one reason why it happens in the Anglosphere is that we all modeled our top universities on Oxford and Cambridge. So our top schools are all residential. You get several hundred or several thousand 18 to 21-year-olds all together with all now hyper-connected by social media, and very arcane ideas can emerge, like words are violence. Not just threats, but words that in any way question certain revered assumptions, those are not just wrong, they are violent. Now, that's a very strange idea. And if you go home on the weekends or you go home at night, as they do at the top schools in France and Germany, your parents will laugh at you. Other people will laugh at you. So these ideas only really breed in very homogeneous, far left liberal arts colleges. And so they're mostly in places like, well, you won't know the names of them here, but our top schools in New England, and actually we have data on this. If you make a map of where the shout downs have occurred, where our speakers literally shouted down, you call it no platforming, but where they literally shouted down, it's almost all in the Northeast, at top schools in the Northeast, and right along the West Coast, the coastal strip. These are some of the most progressive, farthest left parts of the country. It's not that there's something wrong with the left per se. It's that when you have moral and political homogeneity, when everyone thinks the same way, you have the conditions for orthodoxy and a witch hunt. And that's what's happened. Students act as though the campus is a place devoted to pursuing certain political goals, activist goals around fighting for a small set of victims, about 7 or so major victim groups. And any speaker, any person who questions the central assumptions is committing violence and must be banned.
And is this partly because of the way in which these universities have set up their admissions policies? I mean, is there a sense in which the sort of any diversity you like apart from class diversity is one of the analysis of what's going on here?
It probably has something to do with the admission requirements. We do, as we try to do more than, if you just go by tests, you end up, especially with East Asian and South Asian students. And so our top schools are trying desperately to diversify. One of the ways they do that is they place more emphasis on the personal statement. And the best thing you can say in a personal statement is how you've been victimized, and talk about that. So we are rewarding it at many schools in a way. Another factor, and this is actually a major factor that I want to be sure to get into every time I talk about this, because it's the one that people are shocked by, and it's the most important one of all, and that is rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide began rising rapidly around 2012. And this is basically right when, we're talking about Gen Z or Gen Z, you would say here. It's not millennials. It's kids born in 1995 and after. Their childhood was very different than, say, kids born in 1992. They've had social media from the time they were in middle school or age 10, 11, 12. And it seems to have really done a number on them. There are other factors that contributed, but it's when this generation, when kids born in 1995, they first arrive on campus in 2013. That, I believe, is why this new culture suddenly appears, not all over the country, but in the Northeast and the West Coast.
But presumably there must be something about their parents as well in terms of the way in which they were raised. I mean, there's a story in your book which I found so deeply shocking. In fact, I told my wife about this morning. She was horrified about parents that, I haven't got this exactly right, you were saying, who kidnapped their own child in order to illustrate to the child the dangers of stranger danger.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, no, that's right. So media has driven us insane in many ways. In America, when I was growing up, we had a huge crime wave. It was really dangerous. People got mugged. Kids could get mugged. It was really dangerous. But yet still, kids would go outside and play. And we know when it gets dark, you come home. That's the way kids have always been raised. Kids were always let out around age 6 or 7. And you learn independence. You learn, you fall down, you bang your knee, you limp home. You figure out how to deal with it. And we stopped doing that in the 1990s, just as our crime wave was ending. Nobody knew it at the time, but our crime rate was plummeting. I believe it's because we banned leaded gas around 1980, and so you have a whole generation growing up with, for the first time in decades, non-lead damaged minds. But our crime rate plummets in the 90s, and just then we begin to tell our kids, stranger danger, don't talk to strangers. When I was growing up, you didn't have a smartphone. You had to ask strangers for help. Excuse me, sir, do you know how I get to the train station? But kids are taught strangers are dangerous, so don't go near them. They're taught if you're ever out and nobody's looking out for you, there's no adult, you might get abducted.
And is this a collapse of trust in community?
Yes, exactly. So the one place I found, as I've been traveling around, in Northeast Iowa, I found that they still let their kids out at age 6 or 7 because they have so much trust, they don't even lock their doors. But if you live in a city or a suburb, the places that are sending kids to the top colleges, you have such a fear of strangers and abduction. So we taught kids the world is dangerous. I'll just share a funny stat. The rates of child abduction are so low in America that if you were to leave your kid in a car and leave the window open and leave your kid unattended, before you would have to leave your kid there for 700,000 years before the kid would be at risk of actually being abducted. My point is, it doesn't happen, but we started arresting parents who do it, literally arresting them. If a kid is caught playing in a park with no parent watching him at the age of 9, the parents can be arrested.
That's ridiculous.
Yes, it's completely ridiculous. Yeah.
9?
Yep. He could be abducted.
What?
Yeah, I'm not kidding you. So we're insane. We're completely insane in my country in what we've done to our kids.
So we lost a sense that, the village brings up the child type of thing.
We don't have that in America. I mean, look, in rural areas they might still do, but yes,
Okay.
largely we've lost it. Yeah.
Okay. And so, I mean, in those places, and in this country too as well, it's partly, I imagine, to do with the fact that, we move around all over the place so much. So these sort of long-standing communities that, your grandparents have lived there and so forth, those sorts of situations where the place is a place that you trust and that you know.
That's right. It's very hard to run a good society or a successful democracy when you have plummeting trust in each other or in institutions. That's what we have in America, plummeting trust in institutions and each other. I just saw a statistic this morning. As I'm here in the UK for a week, I'm looking up what's going on here, and I found I think Girl Guides did a study, and they showed that the percentage of 7 to 9-year-old girls who are let out, who can go out to the stores with their friends, dropped from something like 52% down to 41%, which seems like a substantial drop. And I'm reading this and I'm saying, 7 to 9-year-old girls are allowed to go to a store? Oh my God! Like in America, it would be 0. Like no 9-year-old kids are allowed out. I'm exaggerating a little bit.
So what one of my children crossed London on the Underground to go to primary school at, I don't know, 10, something like that, on their own. 9 maybe it was. No, 10. So, I mean, I'm quite proud of the fact that I was a parent who allowed that.
There's very good reason to be proud. So what we're both experiencing, both of our countries, even though we have it worse, we overprotect more, but we're seeing a huge rise in depression, anxiety, suicide, especially for girls. It's overwhelming the girls. So I think what's happening here, what Greg and I think is happening here, is we began grossly overprotecting our kids, depriving them of play, giving them more and more classes, more and more academic preparation, even as young as age 6 and 7. Play is what they most need.
Yeah.
Play is the best thing free play. I mean, unsupervised, no adult settling matters, no adult refereeing. That's what they most need. We've deprived them of it, so they don't know how to deal with risk.
They have to play in safe spaces too.
That's
as
right.
Well, don't
Oh
they?
yeah, no, that's right. In fact, no, they need to play in places that are a little bit dangerous.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean.
Right.
What I mean is
No,
I'm not saying that. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. They have to play.
I didn't see the scare quotes around your words.
Yeah,
that's
square
right.
quotes is like people are saying, "Oh no, playgrounds have to be safe. They have to have all that spongy rubber stuff on the floor." And
exactly.
And it's just
that's right.
like, no, they go
if
play
kids if kids can't get hurt on a playground, then they can't learn how to not get hurt.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't want you don't want the risks of death, but there have to be some risks. In California, I heard if there's a tree near a playground, all of the lower branches must be sawn off because, God forbid, a kid should climb a tree. So I'm just saying, we have to think about risk, but we've overdone it in America. We've produced a generation of students that have been overprotected. They're anti-fragile by nature. That is, they actually need some adversity. Human beings need adversity to grow, and we've denied it to them. So this generation raised in the 90s, after 1995, we've weakened them, and then they get social media. So even though the world they live in is so safe, the rates of accidental death are so low now, the rates of violence, even the rates of racism are much, much lower. But they're surrounded by a social media environment that's always putting in their face offenses, racism, threats, violence. So we've kind of made them unprepared for a world and then exposed them to a world that keeps putting virtual threats in their face.
So that's part of what happens with safe spaces.
Exactly.
You have safe spaces to play, and then you expect safe spaces at university.
Exactly. That's right.
So thus far, I think we've agreed. I mean, I've agreed with you anyway. But I'm interested to know where you're going to go with because you're writing a book at the moment on capitalism, which I'm very, very interested in. Now, I'm a sort of creature that doesn't really exist in the United States, which is to say, I'm religious, but I'm a socialist. So I sort of like I have my problems with capitalism, and when I listen to what you're talking about the sort of collapse of community, part of how I would analyse that would be with reference to capitalism, the greatest agent of change the world has ever known, moves people around all over the place, and free flows of capital, free flows of people, and so forth. And these great freedoms have actually been what has deeply damaged community from my perspective. So I would have a sort of, there would be a sort of a capitalist analysis of what you say. I suspect you're more of a liberal than I am. So that's. I'm interested to know what you think here.
Sure. So when I moved to NYU, New York University, to the Stern School of Business in 2011, I had no interest in business at the time. I just wanted to be in New York for a year when The Righteous Mind came out. And so I'm there, I'm teaching a course on business ethics and about all these bad things that businesses are doing. And I bring in the newspaper to show every story on the front page of the New York Times business section is about the stuff we're talking about in this course and conflicts of interest and all sorts of sleazy behavior. And that very day, 1 mile south of me, Occupy Wall Street broke out. And so suddenly everyone's talking about business, capitalism, morality, and politics. And so even though I hadn't intended to stay, they offered me a job, and it was becoming really interesting. I mean, I started reading about capitalism. It's such an interesting history. NYU is a great university. New York's a great city. And so I said, my wife and I said, we think we'll stay. And as I began learning more and more, what I realized is there's this very negative story about capitalism, that it's exploitation. But at the same time, there's this amazingly positive story, and it can be expressed in a simple graph. You draw a straight line, and then at a certain point it goes straight up, and that's basically GDP per capita or human welfare. And it's what Deirdre McCloskey calls the great enrichment. Once we get markets going and a rule of law and ways that merchants can pool their money and take risks together, suddenly we're off to the races. And the percentage of human beings living in extreme poverty goes from 90% or more around 1800 down to just 2 or 3 years ago, we crossed 10% for the first time in human history. Less than 10% of all human beings are living in extreme poverty. So capitalism, markets have also saved, made the world better for the poorest among us. So there's these two stories. How do you reconcile them? That's what the book is about.
But there's absolute poverty as well, but there's also relative poverty, which is to say that, that even though the poorest get richer, the rich get so much richer that the gap between the rich and the poor gets widened and widened and widened, such that you actually have a sense of we're not all in it together.
That's right. So in the U.S. and the U.K., what you said is true, and in many Western countries. In the U.S. more so than most. If you look at inequality between countries, though, the opposite is true. In other words, it used to be that the U.S. and the U.K. dominated. It was so much richer than everyone else. And now because of once China and Asia adopted free markets, they're going up too. So the effects are complicated. And if we just look at our two countries, yes, all the criticism of capitalism are there. The formulation I'm playing with. So my book, the tentative title is 3 Stories About Capitalism, The Moral Psychology of Economic Life. And I'm basically trying to do what I did in The Righteous Mind for politics, I'm trying to do for economics and business. If you're an economist on the left versus an economist on the right, you find different facts to support, is austerity the right response to a recession? It depends on which economics you read. Does raising the minimum wage help the working class? It depends on which economists you read. So the first formulation, as I've been traveling around and looking at different forms of capitalism, is any capitalist system has to attend to both dynamism and decency. And the Anglo-American form has said, well, let's go for dynamism, and then we'll put on some patches here and there for the decency. But if we let's just generate lots and lots of wealth, and then we'll do what we can. The Japanese or the French or some others have placed much more emphasis on decency, but then they get lower growth. They don't have as much dynamism or creativity. The area that seems to have done the best job balancing is Scandinavia. Most people seem to like Scandinavian capitalism, and I think, many people in America think that they're socialist, which was not true at all. They flirted with it but they're not. They're actually free market capitalists who have really good safety nets, and that I think is probably the best. That's probably the right form for most of our societies now.
Help me out with this one, because it's something I don't understand about the States. In a sense, you could make a case that conservatives, true conservatives, should be extremely suspicious of capitalism, because capitalism could be said to destroy social solidarity. And social solidarity is one of the things, traditional communities and all of that thing, that you might want to say that a conservative wants to conserve. And, capitalism is the greatest change agent the world has ever known. So how do you get conservatives who want to conserve being so enthusiastic about the world's greatest change agent? That I don't get.
No, it's surprisingly easy. I read a wonderful economic historian or cultural historian named Jerry Mueller, who explained to me that you can't really define conservatism. Conservatism arises as a reaction to the excesses of progressivism. And so conservatives want to conserve whatever it is that's being threatened, that's being taken down. So if you have a country like the United States, which is founded on ideas of freedom, including economic freedom, if you have a country like the United States, which it takes primary credit, along with Britain, for developing the modern capitalist free market society, well, then that's what you want to conserve.
Oh, I see.
And then you get these newfangled Eastern European, Russian, Soviet, German, Marxist ideas coming in. That's the threat. And so that's the first thing, is that American and British conservatives can justly be proud of trying to conserve something that has brought the world great wealth and prosperity. The second piece of it is that the parties that vote on the right are mixed psychologically, and same with the left. And so you have to distinguish between what Karen Stenner, a political scientist, calls laissez-faire conservatives. Who are not conservative at all. They're what you call in Europe liberals. They believe in free trade. So they are not conservatives like you're talking about. They are we call them libertarians. So they vote on the right because they hate the welfare state and the left's overreach, as they see it.
Tea Party types.
Yeah, that's right. So actually, in fact, right, the Tea Party, it turns out, was exactly a mix between the libertarians who who are generally fine with gay marriage and fine with abortion. So it's the libertarians who want government off our backs, and the true social conservatives, what Stenner calls status quo conservatives. That is, they're the Edmund Burke type conservatives who say, don't change too fast. Wait, let's be careful. Let's not burn everything down. Like, caution.
I get those. Those ones I like.
That's right. That's right. To the extent that you're a conservative in any way or have conservative elements, it's the Burkean conservative, not the laissez-faire.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan Haidt, for talking to me. When you come over here and you see what's going on in this country, I have to ask you a final question about Brexit. Because from an outside perspective, and it plays into all the sorts of things that you're talking about here. How do you analyse what's going on here into Brexit?
Oh my! Well, I think the initial vote, I think the research shows that the dynamics were very similar to what was going on in America and across many countries, which is the globalists versus the nationalists. And so I wrote an essay on this just before the Brexit vote, and then Brexit happened, and I got on a plane. I came over. I happened to be here a couple of weeks after the vote, and so I have an essay. People can look it up. It's called something, Why and How Nationalism Beats Globalism. And then the same thing happened in America. So the dynamics of the original are that. It's the combination of globalization changing the economy, of a lot of people feeling left out and left behind. It's also, in our two countries, we very much have this idea that we're a meritocracy, and the merit is based on your test score. And if you got good test scores, you get into the top universities and get the top jobs. Needless to say, very few people get into those. And what's so pernicious about this kind of meritocracy is that the people at the top believe they earned it.
Yes.
They believe that they deserve to be at the top because they got the highest test scores. They're the smartest.
Yeah.
And I think the coastal elites, as we call them, coastal elites. What do you call them? The London, whatever your word is.
That. Yeah, it is London.
And so,
there's something pernicious about meritocracy, isn't there? And David Goodhart's very good about this.
Yes,
and
that's
he
right.
talks
Anywheres
about,
versus somewheres. That's right. Goodhart really gets it.
But also
That's
the way in which a meritocracy is not very good at distributing esteem.
Exactly.
Because it distributes esteem simply on the basis of how bloody clever you are, and that makes you feel like you sort of earned it and so forth. But there's a great deal of people for whom, and I have them in church. That's probably what I spend my life celebrating is those who maybe not have got the best test scores, but who require and should have considerable esteem, but it's not given to them in this society.
Yeah, that's right. Americans in particular do not begrudge people wealth. Americans do not have any resentment towards those who are rich because we generally have the sense that they earned it, they deserve it. So inequality of outcomes is not a problem if people have the sense that it is merited.
Yeah.
But increasingly, because of the way our system works, more and more people are seeing the system is corrupt. And so in both of our countries, there is a growing attitude of burn it down, just burn the whole damn thing down. And I don't know enough about the Brexit situation to really be able to comment. But often what's happening is when you put it to a referendum, people aren't necessarily voting for a particular thing that they want. They're often voting against something that they hate at present. So again, I don't want to get involved in your internal affairs.
No, I understand.
It's complicated, but the psychology.
It is quite as you say. There's a story about a friend of mine who was campaigning in a very tough neighbourhood in the north, in the Midlands, and knocked on a door, was campaigning to remain in the European Union, and said this woman came out in a really pretty rough estate and said, look, you've got a lot to lose from leaving the European Union. And she said, look around you, I could lose all of this.
Perfect.
And it's just like there's many people for whom the burn it down type of philosophy is just a way of saying, listen to me, I have been unattended to, I have been profoundly ignored, and you too will, feel some of this.
That's right. And in a way, that's really the way democracy is supposed to work. Neither of our countries have direct democracy where the people vote for specific policies. The most important feature of a successful mixed democracy is that the people have an option of saying no, that the people have an option of saying this isn't working, change. And so in both of our countries, many people did that. I don't know. There's not a clear way forward in either country for how to change, but I'm hopeful that we'll figure it out at some point.
Jonathan Haidt, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Giles.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it, and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website unheard.com.